Welcome everyone to today's meet and greet with David Campos. We will be, as you heard, recording the event. So if you don't want to be recorded, one option for you is to turn off your video and set your name to anonymous, and hopefully that'll work for you. So I'll start with a few words about our host organizations. I'm Joanna Gubman, Executive Director of Urban Environmentalists, and we work to transform cities and towns into more sustainable, human-centered, and just communities through land use policy reform. Also hosting is Streets for People Bay Area, whose mission is to reinvent our streets around people, not cars. Streets for People fights for safe streets, fast and frequent transit, and dense, vibrant neighborhoods. And our third co-host is SF YIMBY, a group of San Francisco neighbors who advocate for more housing and want a more affordable and sustainable city. We are all three a part of the YIMBY Action Network. And as you probably know, we are having a special election for San Francisco State Assembly District 17 this February. Our organizations are offering meet and greets with each of the candidates, and today we're having our second in the series featuring David Campos. And I will start us off with a few questions, and then we can move on to audience Q&A. So please be ready to use the Zoom raise hand feature or just type your question when the time comes. So thank you for joining us, David. We're really glad to have you. And rather than my introducing you, I'm hoping you can just tell us a bit about your own story and why housing, transportation, and urban environmentalism matter to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you to the three organizations for hosting this meet and greet and for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. And I think it's really important to engage in these kinds of conversations because the reality is that individuals and organizations tend to be a lot more complicated than the caricature that sometimes is painted by the mainstream media. And I think that if all you knew about me was what the San Francisco Chronicle wrote about me, then you probably would think that I am against everything that these three organizations are trying to fight for, when the reality is far from it. So for me, the three issues that you identify, housing, transportation, urban environmentalism, those are things that are very much, personal to me and my experience in this country. And I actually think that the complexity of the issues doesn't really lend itself to having a meaningful conversation about each of them outside, without these kinds of meetings. So that's why I appreciate this. And so let me begin by simply saying that for me, my involvement in government and in politics specifically is very personal. It has to do with my own personal experience as an undocumented person. I was born in Guatemala, grew up in Guatemala. I eventually made it to this country as an undocumented youth when I was 14. We had actually tried to come before, and we were detained at the border when I was 11. And we spent several weeks at a detention camp. And so the experience of being an undocumented person in this country has very much shaped how I see the world. And the experience that comes with that shapes my views on a lot of the issues that are facing the city. My parents and I, we lived in what today would be called an SRO unit, though at the time we just called it an apartment in South Central LA. And I lived in LA riding public transit, the RTD, as it was called at the time. And what I experienced as a poor undocumented person was, a very tough time living in that kind of an urban environment. Housing was subpar. And I think I wrote a little bit about the fear of eviction that was very much a part of daily life for us, living in very poor conditions without really having any freedom or ability to report those conditions and do something about them. And then, transportation in Los Angeles, RTD was not in any way the system that you would want to see in such a large metropolitan area. And, in some respects, it has to do with the choices that LA made where, car, what's king and actually remains king in many respects in LA. And then, the environment of the places where we lived was not very friendly to a family or to a child. Besides the issues of safety, not really a lot of access to parks or recreational opportunities and activities. So, if there is a political mantra that I have is this idea that we as a society should be judged in terms of our effectiveness or success, not by how those who have the most are doing, by those who have the least, and that has guided my views on a lot of things, and it's something that I care deeply about. I am proud to be a progressive, but I'm also proud to be someone who, in the process of having that view, is very much focused on outcomes and results, because I think that something that happens in progressive politics is that at some point, the ideology and the purity around that ideology becomes the most important thing for some individuals. And to me, that really isn't how I see the world, because the people that I care about, people like my parents, don't want purity, they want outcomes and want results. And in the end, that is what has driven my political life, trying to figure out how to make things happen. And I think that if you look at my history on the Board of Supervisors, my history as chair of the party, and my history as a county administrator, all of that history points to many outcomes and many results, on the issues that I care about. And I think that even though I am not on the Board of Supervisors, the reason why so many supervisors are supporting me is not because they like me better than other people, but because they have seen my results-oriented approach to the work, and they want someone who's going to make things happen and get things done. That is ultimately what I think sets me apart from the field, the ability to get things done. And I think that that is accentuated by an evolution in being, less ideological, less focused on the purity of the outcome, and more practical, focusing on how do we move things forward. And that's why I think that people who don't agree with me are supporting this candidacy. It's not the typical campaign that has both Tom Amiano and Willie Brown, endorsing you at the same time. So let me talk a little bit about housing, transportation, generally. My views on housing have evolved in the sense that I think it's fair to say that, especially on the Board of Supervisors, on larger housing issues, there was, more questions about market rate housing. And in some respects, that had to do with, a reaction to what was happening in my district, and specifically the Mission, which saw a great deal of pressures, that led to gentrification. When the Mission moratorium was first proposed, I was against putting it on the ballot, because one of the problems that I've had with the way progressives look at housing, and in some respects it has to do with the role that the Board of Supervisors plays, where you're voting up and down on projects, is that the focus has been on what we're against, trying to stop a bad project. what I tried to do and tried to convince people unsuccessfully was to say, can we focus on what we want, the kinds of projects we want to see? In the end, the mission moratorium collected signatures because other people actually collected those signatures. And actually, Taco was, I think, very instrumental in that. And in the end, I supported it because the community asked me to support it. The folks that I was close to asked me to. I think that was a mistake, and I think that you learn from that. And where I am on housing is that I do believe that we need all kinds of housing, and I do believe that it is better to have housing built than not, and that this idea of a perfect project, getting in the way of good projects is misguided. But I do believe on housing, and this is where I would say I bring this perspective that's missing, is while I support the efforts to expedite market rate housing and SB 9 and SB 10 being measures that have done that, I think that one thing that is missing on the housing piece is a more concrete identification of sources to fund affordable housing. Affordable housing is not going to be built by the market, and I do think in that area, the government does have a role to play in identifying those sources of funding. And I know that from my own personal experience, because a lot of the work that I did in Santa Clara was on that, and I oversaw the $1 billion housing bond, which is ahead of schedule and on budget. So one of the things that I want to do in Sacramento is to, add to the conversation a discussion of how we fund affordable housing, so that as we expedite all kinds of housing, that we can also move the building of affordable housing forward. That's something that I think is missing or not enough is being done on. So that's one thing. In terms of transportation, I actually spent a lot of time as a supervisor and professionally working on transportation. Scott Wiener and I were actually the representatives of San Francisco on the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And one of the things that I focused on, mainly because at the time there was also a lot of issues around the cost of living and families being pushed out, was the affordability of public transit. And I actually made free Muni for low-income youth happen in San Francisco. And again, it's about results. And I did that with the support of the MTC at the regional level, but also other partners within the city. And I do believe in my heart, and I believe it's practical and it's doable, that public transit should be free. I think that if we do the work and we make a commitment, that we can actually find the funding for it. I am proud that in San Francisco, young people, and I see it, by the way, in my campaign, sometimes you're trying to get to an event and you're trying to have someone drive, and young people don't have a license, because they grew up on Muni. I think that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty neat. I think it's part of what makes San Francisco unique, and I'm happy to have been a part of that, because so many kids were able to ride Muni for free because of our program. I also spent a lot of time as a supervisor working on making our roads and our streets safer for bicyclists. I'm proud of the funding that I identified as a member of the Transportation Authority for bicycle lanes and other things that made the biking infrastructure in District 9, I think, the best in the city. I'm very proud of that. That didn't just happen. I made a point of investing that and making that happen. As chair of the County Transportation Authority, I also tried to figure out how we can make our streets safer. And I do support efforts to, shut down certain streets to cars. And I hope we try it in parts like downtown and other areas of the city. I think it can work. And, in terms of being an urban environmentalist, I think that for the families that I care about, the poor, low-income families that I care about the most, that are struggling, I think they need places that are friendlier. We need to have, more parks. We need to invest in that infrastructure. And, if I'm elected to the state legislature, I'm going to be advocating on all of those issues, and I think that San Francisco should lead on those. So I'll leave it at that, and, hope to take your questions.
Sounds good. Let me maybe start off with one more question, and then we can turn it over to everyone else's questions. You've talked a lot about your history and what you worked on so far. I'm wondering if you can share a bit more with us about looking forward to being at the state level. What would your key policy priorities on these issues be? I know you identified finding more funding for affordable housing. Are there any others you'd like to highlight?
Well, I mean, I think, if there is a theme or a mantra for my campaign, is this idea that coming out of the pandemic, that we need an equitable recovery. Everyone has suffered in the pandemic, but some have suffered more than others, and especially, low-income communities and communities of color. And so that's why my top priority at the beginning of my term will be Medicare for all. I think that coming out of a pandemic where you have seen inequitable access to healthcare, that you have to make that access equitable. And so I think that requires, single payer and Medicare for all. Connected to this idea of an equitable recovery is a jobs program that actually addresses the needs of those that have suffered the most. And I want to push for a Green New Deal, but I want to push for a Green New Deal that begins by emphasizing low income and communities of color that have been impacted disproportionately from an environmental justice perspective by pollution, and places like Bayview Hunters Point, places that really have been neglected. I think that they should be given priority for that kind of a jobs program that I envision. And, the other thing that I think is really critical as you talk about an equitable recovery is education. Education is the great equalizer, is the reason why someone like me is where I am today. I wouldn't be in this position without the public school system. And I think it's shameful that California is in the bottom 10 in per pupil spending among the states, which should be in the top 10. And I think it's shameful that, to this day, so many young people are struggling with college debt. I think the fifth largest economy in the world, which is what California would be if we were a country, should make college free. And I think that we can do it if we have the political will to make it happen.
Thanks. All right, I have some more in my back pocket, but I'm going to turn it over to all of the audience questions first. David, it looks like your hand is raised.
All right, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your time. I have a lot of questions I could ask, but I'll just ask one. I've seen in some of your previous candidate questionnaires that you said you support SB 9 and 10, but also that you are concerned about aspects of it. I read, for example, comparing it to redlining. So I have a two-part question. First, just to be sure we're on the same page, could you describe for us in specific terms your understanding of what SB 9 and 10 do, like what the laws are? And then second, could you describe what specific amendments, given that, you would make to SB 9 and 10, given some of your statements about them?
Well, I think that the main issue that I have with SB 9 and SB 10 has to do with the issue of affordability. I mean, I don't really think that issue was generally addressed, in the legislation. I mean, as you know, SB 9 essentially requires ministerial approval of subdividing, units in RH1 zoning, which I think, I support. The issue of affordability was not addressed. There are questions about whether or not, in this case, the new units would be affordable units. And so, to me, as we're thinking about that's something that I would like to inject. I still support what it did, and I think the concept makes sense. But again, I think that it needs to include an affordability component. In terms of the SB 10, which allows the upzoning, right, of up to 10 units per parcel. I think I support that. I think it's a good concept, and it's actually something that I pushed for when I was on the MTC, especially with near transit. I think it makes sense that we would upzone near transit. Again, I'd like to address the issue of affordability as we look at, creating more units. My hope is that all of those new units, or if we're upzoning, that not all of that will be market rate. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, sorry, I was muted, but I think sort of, I don't want to take time from others, but I guess if you do have just 30 seconds on it, I would be curious to hear, just like when you say like more affordability and there would be good, if you could be specific, like, for example, are you saying that in order to take advantage of SB 10, that cities would have to, should have to require a certain number of units be affordable, or like if people do a lot split, like one of the units would have to be affordable? Like, could you just say more about what you like? Obviously affordability sounds good, but what do you actually mean specifically?
Well, I think that there should be a threshold of affordability that we push for, and I don't know exactly what that would be, but I think that to the extent that there is a creation of more units, I do think that there should be some expectation that at least, some of those new units are affordable. Because I think that if all you're doing is, creating more units that are all market rate, I don't think that you're addressing the entirety of the need. Market rate housing has to be a part of the equation. Someone said, David Campos only supports 100% affordable. That's not true. I mean, the reality is that, you need market rate housing to fund the affordable piece. But what that level should be, we can have a conversation. In San Francisco, we're talking about 25%. That seems to be, something that I could live with, but I think that that's the missing piece, right? That people say build more, have more units in a parcel. Again, if we don't step in and say some of those units should be affordable, that's not going to happen.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on to Will.
Thanks for joining us. My question is about a suburban anti-housing group called Livable California that's recently been pushing for a ballot measure that would prevent the state of California from superseding local land use decisions. The measure they're pushing would have the effect of repealing state laws that encourage the development of both market rate and below market rate housing, would repeal some anti-displacement protections at the state level, environmental rules from the state of California, and also fair housing laws from the state of California. Some of your endorsers, including Supervisor Aaron Peskin, have recently come out in support of that initiative, but I don't want to have any guilt by association there. I'm wondering, do you support or oppose the local control ballot initiative?
I haven't reviewed the measure itself, so I would have to, hold judgment on that. I mean, I think that there is a role for the state, and certainly there's a role for environmental protections and tenant protections. And so I would have questions about, whether something like that would make sense. I do think that it's important for us to think statewide, and, as much as I understand the value of local control, I do think that there is a role for state and regional governments. At the regional level, I was very supportive of, RENA goals and making sure that as the 9-county Bay Area, we required all jurisdictions to build housing. And I think it's appropriate for the state to weigh in and do that with respect to housing. So I would have a lot of questions about that proposal. And, I don't think that we can say that just because someone supports you, that you automatically believe, what they believe. Matt Haney is supported by the trades who have, stood in the way of a lot of environmental reforms. I don't think that he necessarily agrees with that, right? I think we all have perspectives that are our own, and we don't always adopt what our supporters believe on everything.
Thanks. I'll just note you said the word RHNA. That's the Regional Housing Needs Allocation.
Yes, thank you.
Or maybe it's assessment. I think it's allocation. Okay, next rule.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, how's it going? So I recently came more into like local politics and involved with it in like 2021, and I saw that you were on the SF Board of Supervisors in the past. So I wanted to get your perspective, and there's a question of like differences between the housing crisis back when you're a board of supervisor and currently today. And I guess like at what point did it register or kind of click that we do need like this multi-pronged approach for different types of housing at all levels?
Sure, thank you. I mean, look, I think that I have actually always been supportive of more housing. I think it's just a question of degree. If you actually look at my record as a supervisor, I probably only had in my entire 8-year tenure 1 or 2 projects that ever went to an appeal before the Board of Supervisors, because most of the projects that came before my office, we worked them out and we approved them. Oftentimes with, most of the time without even going to the Board of Supervisors. And I think that's a difference actually, and I think that whatever you think about what happened, recently with, the D6 project, one of the differences in my approach is that I always work hard on individual projects to make sure that they were approved, and that's not the case in the Stevenson project. But I think that to be honest, when I was a supervisor, the biggest issue facing places like the Mission was actually evictions. So in some respects, we had to stop the bleeding, if you will. So a number of the things that I did focus on how to stop evictions, which I think, by the way, is consistent with this idea of more housing, because I think that, my experience is that the folks that want more housing also want, tenant protection. So I did things like passing the law that prevented the eviction of educators during the school year, as an example. I did the law that dealt with relocation costs for tenants, and that's at that particular time, that was the big challenge, facing my district in particular. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I voted against the Twitter tax break, was that, as I explained at that time, you're bringing in Twitter, and creating incentives, but you're not requiring them to hire from the neighborhood, from the city. So they're going to hire from the outside. And so these folks are going to come in, and unless you give them a place to live, they're going to come into the Mission and push out the people that are there because they'll have the ability to pay more. And that's precisely what happened, So I think my evolution has to do with what I have seen, and quite frankly, my experience, and, when I left the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, I went to Santa Clara County, where I oversaw the implementation of $1 billion housing bond, where we oversaw the goal of building 4,500 units of supportive housing over 10 years, and I want to bring that to the state, because I think that for the housing crisis to be addressed, the state needs to play a bigger role, not only in setting goals and objectives and pushing the, expediting the building of market rate housing and all kinds of housing, but identifying again that source of funding for the affordable housing that the market won't build. So thank you for your question, Raul.
Of course.
All right, I think we have a question from Zach. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, parking is kind of a unfortunate favorite topic for us, given the way it intersects with, land use and transportation. I'm wondering if you support bills like AB 1401, which didn't quite make it through last year, which would have eliminated mandatory parking for housing in, some transit-rich areas, or if you support other parking reforms, like unbundling or parking, more appropriate parking fees, and how would you address the challenging politics of parking?
Well, I think it's a complicated issue, but I don't necessarily think that parking and housing have to go hand in hand. So I am a big proponent of public transit. And so I would be open, to any effort that promotes public transit. And I don't think that it is a right that, whenever you buy a unit, that it has to come with parking. And by the way, I mean, I have supported a lot of things like parklets, and, if there is one, I guess some positive things that have come out of this horrible pandemic is that, I see more parklets, and I think that's a good thing.
That's an area I'm curious about as well. Let me just re-ask the second part of Zach's question, which is how would you address the very challenging politics around all of that?
I mean, I think the devil's in the detail when it comes to parking, and I do think that you have to look at the needs of a particular neighborhood and a community when it comes to those issues, so I don't know if there is a specific concern around parking that you're thinking about, because I want to make sure that I answer your question, so I don't know exactly what, if there's something more specific that you would like for me to address.
Zach, did you want to clarify anything more about 1401, or do you feel like that got answered?
Yeah, I guess generally it sounds like you're in support of removing mandatory minimum parking requirements. AB 1401, I think, was actually, it might have been housing in some commercial applications in certain areas. I think we would support generally eliminating them.
Yeah, I would be open to that.
Okay, while we are on the subject of cars, we have a car question from Andrew. Do you want to unmute yourself, or I can read for you? Let's see. All right, I will read it for him. His question is, we are generally concerned with the fact that freeways run through low-income and minority communities in San Francisco and throughout California, making them higher pollution areas that are more dangerous to people not in cars. What policy ideas do you support to mitigate or eliminate these impacts?
Can you repeat that again? I'm sorry. I'm trying to.
Sure. It's also in the chat window if it helps.
Okay, let me read it in the chat just to make sure.
It's the question from Andrew
For low income
about freeways.
And throughout California, making them higher pollution areas that are more dangerous. Well, I mean, I think that this is where, it's about equity, right? So why is it that freeways are designed, so that they go through low-income communities and mostly communities of color. So I think that, looking at designs from an equitable perspective is important. I think that the issue of, when it comes to transportation and getting people from point A to point B, I do think that we need to look at that from an equity perspective, to see how roads are designed and why is it that the expectation is that certain communities are going to be, it's okay for them to be more disproportionately impacted than others, And I try to think about that as a member of the MTC, but I think that the state itself needs to think more about that, in terms of how to mitigate or eliminate those ideas. I think there has to be a more comprehensive review of that, and I think that how our highways and roads are designed is something that should be looked at from that equity lens. I have some experience in history in looking at things from an equitable perspective, because as a deputy administrator in Santa Clara County, I created the Division of Equity and Social Justice, which actually analyzes county departments and county programs from an equity perspective. And I think that how we build our highways and roads should be included at the state level.
Okay, thank you. Now, I don't know how to pronounce your name, either Dana, or Dana. Would like to ask your question?
Yeah, Dana. Actually, Keith, though. Hi. So I'm not sure if you've seen, the news just came out today that the California HCD has opened an investigation into some of San Francisco's recent project disapprovals, or at least postponements, with questions whether San Francisco is living up to some of the commitments it made in its latest housing element, and whether it's fulfilling its requirements under such state laws as the Permit Streamlining Act and HAA. But also this kind of dovetails into the earlier question about Aaron Paskin endorsing the Livable California ballot measure, basically implying that the state has been overbearing on San Francisco's ability to do its own land use. Obviously, as a hopeful elected representative of San Francisco, but also a state legislature, you'd be right in the middle of this sort of tension between local and state beliefs about what the correct land use should be. I believe Senator Wiener himself said that HCD's investigation of San Francisco was harsh, but ultimately fair. So I'm curious, you said you believe there is a role for the state to play in housing law. Do you believe, though, that the state has been too overbearing so far and San Francisco should be given more leeway? Or would you do you support HCD's investigation? And would you be in favor of expanding their capabilities to do such investigations? Sorry.
Well, I mean, I don't have a problem with the state coming in, and to the extent this is driven by what happened with the Stevenson project, I hope they look into it. I think that one of the things they'll find in that is that one of the reasons why that project didn't move forward is because the supervisor in that district and their office didn't do their job. So I have no problem with the state coming in and looking at that. I do think that the state has a role to play in terms of meeting our goals and objectives around housing. So I don't have a concern about that. I think that there is a role for local and state government on these issues.
Okay. I think we've got a question from Rajiv.
Okay.
Rajiv, I don't know if you'd like to unmute, or I can read your question out.
Is this about the mission moratorium, I think?
Yeah, maybe I'll just read it out. So the question from Rajiv is, you supported a couple versions of the proposed mission moratorium on building new housing, but neither passed. Do you think housing would be cheaper in the mission if either measure had passed?
Again, I think I've said that the the mission moratorium was misguided. I mean, I think that the piece about the moratorium that I liked, and by the way, London Breed as a supervisor supported the mission moratorium at the board as well. I think the piece that I appreciated about the mission moratorium was the effort to have the city buy more land, land bank, buy land, acquire it, and build, housing on it. That's the piece that I think the city can do more of. But I don't think that you need a moratorium to make that happen.
All right, we have a second question from Raul.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, I guess typically in like lower income communities, like something that I've had previous opinions on, but have been just in passes, when something visibly has been changing, like a neighborhood, which feels like it's changing, or that is gentrification, or the feeling of that has occurred. One example recently is on Shotwell Street in San Francisco. Calle 24 had this like petition, which I totally understand. Like, again, I empathize with them on like having these like these barricades, bike barricades, making sure on Shotwell that there's more safety for bicyclists. However, there's this like misconception of it, it kind of like infringing again on that location, and visibly what people in that district, Mission District in particular, felt like there was actual gentrification. How would you in office, how or would you consider providing clarification or education, or like how would you lead in like clarifying those types of situations not being quite displacement related causes, but other things? Or how would you go about those conversations? Yes. Yeah.
Can you sort of say again, sort of like with the idea of being barricades were placed in the neighborhood?
Yeah. So SFMTA had slow streets. Recently, one of them on Shotwell, and along Shotwell and 24th, there was like some barricades added, so that way to make sure that those like there could be slow passage for bicyclists or even people walking on that slow street. However, one group, Calle 24, they had a petition recently that came up, which was to have the it's like plastic barricades. They're like very plastic and singular, be removed, and that was because of there was this misconception of like visibly those things are added, therefore gentrification is happening again, or something.
Well, I mean, yeah. Look, I mean, I think that it requires a conversation, and I do believe that dialogue is important, and I mean, I think that there is a sentiment, and I understand where it's coming from, that any effort to make streets safer, slow traffic down, or even something like a parklet, that those are signs of gentrification. There are people who believe that, and that, by the way, comes out of, what they have experienced, and their own fear, right? I do think it's important to engage in those conversations, but at the end of the day, I think that it's important for people like me to say, well, I understand the concerns about gentrification. I don't think that that's what's driving this, that what's driving this is actually to make the street safer, And so I think dialogue is important, but I also feel that it's important to take the steps that make a neighborhood safer, and parklets are things that a lot of people have not supported in the past for fear of gentrification. But I still support them because I don't think that it is about gentrification. It's about making the space more livable.
All right, thanks. Let's move on to Chong.
Hi, thank you. So we've been talking about the affordability and how like the affordability percentages are the kind of things that you look for new housing projects. And then for the Stevenson project, I know we talk about this a lot, but and you had a statement regarding about how only 6% of those units are available to San Francisco's 6% of the affordable. So my question to you is like, is it the affordability percentage? Is that what you care about, or is it more about the percentage of affordable units that are available for the people who are already located in that stuff? And if so, what is the right percentage for that?
Thank you for that question. And I don't know that I have a magic number. I mean, I think that 25% affordability on site is something that I think, is doable from my perspective. I don't think that all of that has to be for San Francisco residents. The problem I have with the Stevenson project is that even though it got to 25% affordability, 10.5% of that was through fees. And my experience as a supervisor is that, I would rather have the units built on site when the project is completed. Because my experience with fees is that it always takes so much longer to build the units. And oftentimes you end up building fewer units because the money, gets you less when you spend it down the road, and so to me, 14.5% on site is not sufficient affordability from my perspective, So I think 25 is a good threshold. I also think that in some cases you can have more, and those of us, when the D6 supervisor ran for supervisor, that campaign promised that they would negotiate with developers to get as much affordability as possible. And I think 14.5 on site is so inadequate compared to some of the percentages that the prior supervisor got in that district, So I think that the main thing is affordability for me, but I do think that some of the units should go to San Franciscans as well.
All right, thanks. Let's come back to Dana and Keith.
Hey, I just had a really quick open-ended question. So what do you think the state can do to make housing affordable for middle-income families?
I think it has to identify a source of funding for it. I think that there should be a statewide housing bond. And I do think that it should include different levels of affordability, low income for sure, but also middle income. And so I think that identifying sources of funding is really critical. I also think, by the way, we need to look at some of the changes that are happening with some of the tax credits. There are some legislative proposals that are focusing exclusively on allowing for tax credits to prioritize, building in the suburbs, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, but I would have a problem with it if it's at the expense of building in places like San Francisco, building affordable in places like San Francisco. I think that we need to, the state needs to weigh in and step in. And by the way, it's not just, middle income housing, but I am very concerned about first responder housing. God forbid if there is fires or an earthquake in San Francisco. So many of our first responders live out of the city, and many of them have to cross bridges to get to San Francisco. I think that we would be in deep trouble unless we do something to address that issue. Thank you for your
Great.
question.
Zach, I think you have a second question.
Yeah, I guess maybe building on that, one of the ways to make housing more affordable is to reduce uncertainty in the approval process. So do you think reducing discretionary review has a role to play? And one example of that would be reforms of the California Environmental Quality Act to remove barriers to some types of infill housing.
I mean, I think I want to explore all options, and I responded that I was open to CEQA reform, and someone said, "Oh my God, I can't believe he said that." I mean, I think that, given where we are on the housing front, this is the time to revisit all issues, so I'm open to that dialogue. What that looks like, I'm not sure, but I certainly would be open to having that conversation. One of the things that I can tell you, it's so interesting, because in Santa Clara County, with Measure A, which is the $950 million housing bond that we passed, the county was essentially the bank, because counties don't have land use approval unless you're San Francisco, where you're a city and county. And so, we have to put together groups of projects that we have to get approved by city councils within the county. And it's interesting that, within the 4-year period that I was there, we were able to get, basically, more than 2,000 units approved by 15 different city councils. That was easier to do than what was happening in San Francisco, which is operating as a city and county. And so I think that there is room for us to do better, and I'm open to having that conversation.
All right, I think maybe I'll ask one since I don't see any hands raised. I'm curious if you could talk, we've talked a lot about local issues. You could talk a bit more about the state level. The legislature is a tough place. How will you get some of these very challenging reforms done?
Yeah, I think that's something that sets me apart. I am someone who has a track record of getting things done in very difficult environments. If you look at the landmark pieces of legislation that I passed as a supervisor, whether it's our sanctuary law, our universal health care law that closed the loophole to allow that to happen, our Clean Power SF, which created 100% renewable energy to compete against PG&E, our legacy business program, all of those pieces of legislation I had to pass because of the makeup of the board with a super majority, because they all face vetoes from the mayor. So I had to bring a lot more conservative members of that body along, okay? When I was in Santa Clara County, I had to get that housing built. I actually created 2 different government agencies, one that focuses on protecting workers, an Office of Labor Standards Enforcement. I have to get that through in a much more conservative environment in a county of 2 million people. That includes, by the way, 25% of the population in Santa Clara County voted for Donald Trump. I was the person that the county went to whenever there was something complicated that had to be done. I did that. I was elected chair of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors of the San Francisco Democratic Party, where I think that I proved to be an effective person who brought people together and made the party effective. And that takes a certain level of skill. And because of that skill, I was asked to run to be vice chair of the state party. I think that the reason why people like, Willie Brown, the majority of the Board of Supervisors are supporting me is because they want someone who knows how to make things happen, who is a workhorse. And I am a workhorse. And I am someone who can bring people together and for the purpose of getting things done. And that's what I think is needed. And I think that my relationships as vice chair of the party will allow me to be effective from day one. And you know, I'm also, if elected, I will be the first Latino elected from San Francisco. And that I think is significant because the Latino caucus, which has endorsed me, is the largest caucus in the state legislature. And quite frankly, at times has been the place where many good pieces of legislation go and die. And so having someone who can build those relationships and develop that support is really important, you know, and I think what makes me also unique is that I am running to be in Sacramento as an assembly member. This is not a stepping stone to the next thing. I want to be there for 12 years if my constituents will have me, because I think that it takes time to develop the relationships that you need to move things forward in Sacramento.
Great, thanks. Will, if you would like to be very, very fast, and David, very, very fast in responding, let's have one last question.
Thanks. So I guess trying to tie in some threads overall, you mentioned how you wish that Matt Haney had negotiated for more affordable units on site at the Stevenson project, maybe worked harder to get it over the line himself. I know you're running against him, but if you can try to set aside any particular example, I just want you to try and speak to what is your vision for how we build more housing in California. Is it individual supervisors negotiating with developers about individual projects, or is it setting objective standards for projects and allowing ministerial approval of those projects as long as they meet those standards by right?
Well, I mean, I think that you know what happened with the Stevenson project and what I've been asked to opine is the role of the Board of Supervisors. You know, and I do think that to build more affordable housing within the city and county of San Francisco, you need more involvement by the supervisors. I think what happens at the state is different. And, you know, my view is that the work that has been done to expedite building of certain housing makes sense. What I think is missing is the affordability piece, you know, and I think that adding that piece will, in my view, complete the picture, so that we do build more housing throughout the state of California, but that we build all kinds of housing, not just market rate housing. And I think that market rate housing has a role to play, and it's a place, and it's an important place, role in these projects. It funds affordable housing, but you have to have affordability. And actually, I think that that's where, by the way, San Franciscans are. If you ask San Franciscans, they will agree that we need more housing, but they will also agree that we need more affordable housing, you know? And I think the focus has been so much on expediting housing that there hasn't been enough of a concern about the type of housing that is expedited. It shouldn't just be market rate housing.
All right. And with that as a good housing question, I think we are exactly at time. So thank you so much for joining us today. David, thank you so much for everyone who showed up and asked all your great questions. We will be posting this event on YouTube soon and sending it out so that you can share it with any friends who couldn't make it today. And our next meet and greet will be with the Assemblymember on December 7th. So I look forward to seeing you there. Take care, everyone.